So thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here in Israel, especially as an American, to remember the impacts of the Al-Qaeda attacks in America in 2001. You know, sometimes we tell ourselves that we will never forget. Certainly we say that about 9/11. But as time passes, memories tend to fade and lessons become more obscure. So I think this ICT annual conference performs a very important function every year. I remember 9/11, September 11th, very clearly. It was a personal family experience. We lived in Washington, D.C. at Fort Myer, within sight of the Pentagon. My wife on that day was working at the UN and traveling to Manhattan. Our daughter's school bus passed the Pentagon early that morning. I was an Army colonel traveling with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to a NATO meeting in, I think, Bucharest. Not quite, don't have that part of the memory. And as we approached in his plane, the UK airspace, we were listening to BBC radio. And we got the first indication that a plane had hit the North Tower. We thought, boy, that's peculiar, because we had overflown Manhattan, and it was a crystal clear blue sky day on that Tuesday morning. We went a bit further, reported the second plane, turned around, refueled, picked up 2 F-15 fighter escorts, again overflew Manhattan on our way back to Washington, and now, of course, the plume from the towers was at 20,000 feet. Landed at Andrews Air Force Base. When we landed, we could look across the skyline, Pentagon's only a few miles away, and see the smoke from the burning Pentagon where our offices were. When we arrived at the Pentagon, it had already been marked off as a police site, you know, with the yellow warning tape. We crossed the tape. One image that just will always be with me is that there was a lone aircraft seat on the lawn of the Pentagon at the site of the impact. How one seat managed to stay intact and land there is beyond me, but it sticks with me. So this was a very personal experience on 9/11. And you know, on that day, although we didn't fully appreciate it, we were experiencing history. And we were unsure of where we were headed. We didn't know what lay ahead. And we were in the midst of a historical moment. We know that now, but at that time, we were too close to it to appreciate its impact. Now, I know of no conference worldwide that each year examines counterterrorism in such depth and breadth as this ICT conference, remembering 9/11 and assessing the changing environment here at the 20-year mark. And that is entirely appropriate, as we are very much still living with the impacts of 9/11. But in my short presentation today, I want to break with the theme. I want to take a bit of an excursion from the counterterrorism theme. And I'd like to offer a broader geostrategic context to this conversation, to the conference. I want to suggest that today we stand again at another historic moment, perhaps as important as 9/11. I believe we are what we might call at a strategic inflection point or a pivotal moment. I think the impacts of what we are experiencing today will be fundamental and wide-ranging, and that the future, because we are at this moment, will not resemble the past. We'll have a break in continuity with history. I've had 3 of these moments in my professional lifetime. If you bear with me, I'll just outline these quickly. 11/9, 9/11, and 2/24, right? So 11/9, November 9th, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, essentially the beginning of the end of the Cold War, a long era of continuity. 2 years later, followed by the dissolution of the Soviet Union. On 11/9, I was an Army major, and my unit was patrolling the inter-German border. Just think about that. 30 years ago, the inter-German border. That's a historical landmark today. We don't even think about it much. But we're still living today with the impacts of 11/9. Next, in my experience, 9/11. Well, that's familiar now, right? We've been talking about that for several days. And the impacts from 9/11, as this conference demonstrates, are still being felt today. And now I think I'd like to offer today 2/24, February 24th this year, right, with the Russian full-scale conventional invasion of a neighboring state. War has returned to the European continent. And I think that 2/24, as we look back, we're almost too close to it today, but as we look back on what happened in the last 6 months, it will register as significant an impact as 11/9 and 9/11. Now, we're only beginning to see those impacts today because, again, we're very close to history, right? They will play out, in my view, over the coming decades. And just as we're still living with the impacts of 11/9 and 9/11, what are the impacts that we know so far from 2/24? So first, obviously, the epicenter, Ukraine itself. 7 million IDPs, 5 million Ukrainian refugees, significant casualties on both sides of the fight itself, significant impact on the Ukrainian infrastructure, registering in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And those, I think, those estimates must be low, given the extent of the damage. Estimated 45% cut in Ukrainian GDP this year, 45% cut, and they're all but cut off from the lifelines, that is, their access to the sea, in terms of recovering that economy, except for the port of Odessa so far. Now that epicenter, that initial shock, I think, will be followed by a series of concentric shock waves, aftershocks, if you will, right? And we're beginning to see the second wave of effects, which extend beyond Ukraine itself. So here, economic effects like sanctions on Russia, where 60% of global GDP is assembled in a coalition, an economic coalition, to punish Russia and to limit its economic ability. That should result, on estimates, about a 15% reduction on Russian GDP. We've seen the effort in Europe to reduce their dependence, their reliance on an unreliable energy source, Russia. And this is playing out in both the oil and the gas chains. Supply chain reductions supply chains have been interrupted in international food supplies. We're beginning to see that. On the security front, we're seeing NATO position troops where they'd never been before on a sustained basis on the eastern flank of NATO. And we've even seen two previously neutral states, Sweden and Finland, give up several hundred years of neutrality to join the NATO military alliance. That's pretty significant second wave of shocks. I think there's a third wave beyond that. We're going to see market disruptions resulting in inflation. Inflation in my country is at 8% today. That's becoming a real political issue. And this rolls back to the initial shock of the war in Europe. We're going to see longer-term disruptions in the energy markets, oil and gas. We'll see those impact on the LNG marketplace, on the nuclear energy marketplace, and so forth. We've seen the reduction in fertilizer. Who knew that fertilizer was a major output, a major export of this part of Europe? And that, of course, will have yet another impact on agricultural productivity. And finally, on the security front, I think militaries around the world will watch this conflict very closely and draw some conclusions about the way to fight, very distributed, decentralized command and control, and so forth. Very interesting, we haven't yet seen a repercussion or a shock wave in terms of the Chinese perception of what's happening in Ukraine today. What lessons does President Xi and his government draw from this military conflict in Europe? So, look, I think there are implications, repercussions, shock waves, aftershocks, if you will, that have not yet been realized, and I think we're going to live with this. Look, we might even be imagining the future of Russia and its 7,000 nuclear weapons. That may be a downstream effect that will emanate from this initial shock. But what's really at risk? And now, the next series of speakers here are to give you an American perspective, right? So I'm giving you the sense of what's happening in Washington today. And a big sense of what's happening in Washington is that there are geostrategic impacts, big impacts from the war in Ukraine. And essentially the way this is being framed in Washington is that it's a struggle between two fundamental systems of international relations. On the one hand, the model of the nation state, which goes all the back to the 17th century, right? The notions of state sovereignty, territorial integrity, and so forth. So the nation state as the organizing principle, and that competes with the alternative of empires, right? And this is really the history of most of us in this room, the 20th century wars against empires, right? World War I, a war against empires. World War II, the post-colonial period. You can argue the Cold War was a war against empires. So you have this competition between two visions or two organizing principles of the international system, nation states and empire. And now you have President Putin rolling back the clock, at least that's his rhetoric, where he intends to reestablish his image of the Russian Empire. And he discards, in the meantime, all the rules of the road that go back to not only the Treaty of Westphalia, but the embodiment of the UN Charter and so forth. So that's how this is being viewed fundamentally in Washington today. And yes, we still live with the aftershocks of 9/11, and I would argue even 11/9, right? The breakup of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But just like those previous historical moments, I think the impacts of 2/24 will be with us for decades. And while this conference rightly every year refocuses us on the impacts of 9/11, I think it's important for all of us to recognize, and that was the intent of my excursion here in these brief remarks, that while we're still living with the impacts of 9/11, there are emerging challenges that we have to confront, because those emerging challenges, like the war in Ukraine, will compete for policy bandwidth in capitals like mine and yours, and also for resources. So we can't, while it's important to focus every year here at ICT in a world-class forum on counterterrorism, we must appreciate that counterterrorism plays out in a wider perspective. So thank you very much, and I'll turn to the next speaker.